Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today, spending your lunch break for many of you with UCAN and Dr. Jeff Volek. I'm Varun Sriram, your host today, and really happy to welcome Dr. Jeff Volek to the discussion today. Dr. Volek is a cutting-edge researcher looking at dietary issues impacting health in America. Jeff, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Hi, Varun. Great to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Jeff, just before we get started, just want to give folks a little bit more of an understanding of who you are and some of the work that you've done. So, as you can all see on the screen, Jeff's credentials, they're impressive. A PhD in exercise physiology and nutrition, master's in exercise science, both from Penn State University. And Jeff's primary research over the years has really focused in two areas. Number one is on the physiological adaptations to low-carb diets, with an emphasis on outcomes related to metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. He's also conducted a lot of research on the impact of dietary supplements on exercise performance and overall health, and lots of research specifically on whey protein. And I know many of you in the audience have likely read two of Jeff's books, The Art and Science of Low Carb Living, The Art and Science of Low Carb Performance. Jeff's also been involved authoring another book, The New Atkins for a New You. All really good, informative, educational reads. So strongly encourage you folks to check those out for more information. But Jeff, before we get started in the meat of our discussion, what I wanted to find out a little bit of your background. What got you interested, overall in exercise physiology and nutrition, and then more so from there, what got you interested specifically in exploring the benefits of a low carbohydrate diet?
Well, very briefly, I was an athlete as a kid, and was active in sports throughout high school, and just became very interested in how I could optimize my performance through nutrition. So when I went to college at Michigan State, I studied dietetics with the hopes that I could learn something about how my body responded to food and enhance my performance. So this was 25 plus years ago, and as you can imagine, going through a traditional dietetics program, I was taught the basic virtues of a low-fat diet and more or less a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach to prescribing diets for all conditions, and that really wasn't exactly satisfying to me. So as I was pursuing my graduate work, I wanted to get involved more in research and more cutting edge type concepts. And I was very fortunate to go to Penn State and work with world class mentor there, William Kramer, who I continue to work with today. And we were just in a very vibrant research laboratory and culture, and really pushing the envelope and studying a variety of different exercise and nutritional interventions. And that's where I really was exposed to creatine supplementation for the first time, and started to do a whole series of studies as part of my master's thesis, and several follow-up studies over the next decade. But that really sort of sparked an interest in me in the scientific process, and being exposed to the scientific method, and really wanting to understand nutrition on a much deeper level. That led me to low carbohydrate diets, which was sort of anathema to the rest of the mainstream nutritional consensus world. And that's kind of taken me down a rabbit hole over the last 20 years, and trying to push that concept out as as one approach to maintaining health, especially for those individuals who don't process carbohydrates very well. And so we've been sort of pushing the science in terms of how low carbohydrate diets might be a better approach for managing obesity and diabetes, and now even for elite athletes who are not responding well to the high carb loading approaches.
That's great, Jeff, and that's a kind of a great way to transition us into a little bit of an overview of what we hope to discuss over the next 55 minutes or so. So we're really going to start with the why of all of this. Why do we want to care about controlling our carbohydrates or lowering our carbohydrate intake? From there, we want to move a little bit into a discussion on the quality of carbohydrates. What makes something a good carbohydrate, and how should folks think about the timing of implementing carbohydrate into their life? And then we're really going to talk specifically about carb control for health and fitness, carb control for performance, and then time permitting, we'll do our best to answer questions. I really appreciate all you folks who took the time to send in your detailed questions, and do know whether or not Dr. Volek and I address them here on this webinar. You will be hearing from me over the next day or two with some feedback on the specific questions. But we tried to tailor the subject matter today kind of to fit what the most people were curious about and inquiring about. So, in starting our discussion, Jeff, there seems to be, over the last several years, this awakening in the national consciousness of the ill effects of sugars and refined grains. And now the 2015 U.S. Dietary Guidelines that are expected to be adopted includes a reduction in sugar and refined grains as one of the major points of it. And some are calling this a quote unquote radical recommendation to cap added sugar to 10% of the daily diet. Now the old dietary guidelines from 2010 recommended about 45 to 65% of calories come from carbohydrate for adults. Just from a general perspective, Jeff, what are the health concerns with a diet that is high in sugar and refined grains?
Well, the way I like to sort of bring this up, and this is not always described in this way, is the principle of human carbohydrate intolerance. And this really stems from over 200 million years of evolution when most of us were exposed to little amounts of carbohydrates. And now in today's modern world, sort of post-advent of modern agriculture, most of us are exposed to a whole lot of carbohydrates. And the fundamental problem is the majority of us are now showing signs of metabolic dysfunction. And for many in this group, a modest reduction in dietary carbohydrates suffices to prevent overt illness. But there's at least a third of us with metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes that requires that we restrict carbs even more, perhaps at the level that induces keto adaptation. And this is a process that sustains optimum fuel flow to all organs, including the brain, through use of metabolic pathways we've acquired over 2 million years of evolution as hunters and gatherers. So it's this idea that we're really over-consuming carbohydrate, and that includes both sugars and starches, relative to our individual tolerance. And that really does vary a lot from person to person. But when you do overconsume carbs, a whole lot of metabolic problems start to manifest that, if over time, leads to type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and probably other non-communicable diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's as well. It's quite interesting how all of these chronic diseases, although very complex in terms of the pathophysiology, seem to have a common thread that relates back to insulin resistance or carbohydrate intolerance. So although nutrition is very complex and so is chronic disease, there is a lot of footprints in the sand that are leading us back to this idea we're over consuming sugars and starches and disposing of them in improper ways that over time really harms the body.
Now, specifically, Jeff, the carbohydrate is the nutrient that's most going to impact your blood sugar levels. And as we're looking on the screen here, why should we be concerned about our blood sugar levels? What does blood sugar dictate? What does blood sugar kind of affect that's occurring in our bodies?
Well, again, at risk of oversimplifying things here, I mean, the problem with over-consuming carbohydrates is you really start to bias your metabolism toward carbohydrate oxidation while simultaneously inhibiting your body's ability to burn fat. And this is a very, predictable, reliable effect of carbohydrates. And we're starting to understand when cells switch over to burning almost all carbs, that's not necessarily a healthy outcome. We're much better off if we're burning fat most of the time and only rely on carbohydrate metabolism when we have to do intense types of exercise. Whereas most of the time during rest and submaximal exercise, if we can burn more fat, that's a good thing. So that's kind of a one aspect. The other is when you eat carbs, your body stimulates insulin levels, and we're now understanding that constantly bombarding your pancreas to secrete more insulin in order to dispose of that carbohydrate leads to a lot of problems as well. You know, notwithstanding the fact that's the primary stimulus for inhibiting the fat burning, but insulin in and of itself probably causes harm to cells and may actually be an important driver in many types of cancer, for example.
So how did we get here, Jeff? I guess that's the big question. How and why was the food pyramid that we followed over the last several decades structured in such a way where the average American is really over consuming carbohydrate?
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating discussion, and people have written books about that topic. But I guess the simple answer is we have a burgeoning population. We had to feed a lot of people, and agriculture was one solution where we could grow a lot of food relatively cheaply and feed many people. And subsequently, that's became a staple food in the diet. And we've built an entire economy and industry around carbohydrate-based foods. And then you have sugar, the advent of sugar and high fructose corn syrup and all these types of things as well on top of the grains and starches that are predominating our diet. And you have to understand this is relatively recent, and when you look in the context of the human history. I mean, if agriculture was invented 10,000 years ago, that's 1 or 2% of human history. So we haven't had a lot of time um, to evolve to be able to handle all this extra carbohydrate that we're consuming. And so again, we're coming back to this idea of carbohydrate intolerance. Um, most of human history, we just did not have to deal with the loads of sugars and starches that we're dealing with today, and many people are just not hardwired to be able to process all these carbohydrates. So I think we had good intentions, but in many ways, modern agriculture has caused us to be obese and type 2 diabetic. Now, there is a minority of the population that does fine on that, but when you have 2/3 of Americans overweight, 1/3 with metabolic syndrome, that's actually a minority of the people. I mean, the majority of us now would be considered unhealthy based on BMI. But we do have to always appreciate that there's a lot of differences between people, and when we talk about diet and nutrition, we always have to appreciate this idea of individual variation amongst people. But clearly, a lot of people are struggling to process the current level of carbohydrate they're consuming, and that's why we have these epidemics of obesity and diabetes that are spreading across the planet like a slow-moving plague.
And to that point, Jeff, as you've spoken about carbohydrate intolerance, I guess part of what goes into this restriction of carbohydrates and how much an individual may feel the need or the benefit in doing so depends on their individual tolerance to carbohydrate, which you just detailed. Now, if we kind of look at the spectrum of things we may discuss today. You've got your extreme restriction of carbohydrate, which is the ketogenic diet, which you referenced, which is really teaching your body to utilize different pathways for fuel. Then you've got kind of low carb, which I don't know what the kind of the formal definition is. I'll ask you to weigh in on that in a moment. And then we've got this idea simply of carbohydrate control, trying to lower your intake of simple sugars and refined carbohydrates. How do you, in thinking about, kind of the different ways people talk about this, how do you view them? Is there a number that people consider low carb? Is there a number that people should look at for a ketogenic diet? I just love you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there really are no formal definitions for some of these terms like high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, or ketogenic. People have kind of operationally defined those terms by certain percentage or absolute amount of carbohydrate in the diet. But I think that, we could debate what those numbers might be. But at the end of the day, coming back to the idea that it all comes down to the person, it really depends on your own level of carbohydrate intolerance. So to me, finding that level of carbohydrate tolerance for yourself and making sure you consume less than that is really key to maintaining health. And unfortunately, we don't have objective diagnostic tests today that really give us objective information on whether or not we're consuming a level below our tolerance. But we have to kind of find that out through self-experimentation. And if you can maintain your weight and maintain your blood sugar levels and hemoglobin A1C and other health parameters, then you're consuming carbs at an appropriate level. So everybody's different. Some people have a high genetic propensity to develop type 2 diabetes when they consume carbs. Other people don't. But it even changes within a person over the lifespan. So you may be able to tolerate more carbs when you're younger, but as you age, you tend to develop more insulin resistance or carbohydrate intolerance, and so you may have to adjust your carbohydrate intake as you enter into middle age and so on. So can be even a moving target within a person, but this to me is really fundamental in the idea of personalized nutrition and personalized medicine or personalized health, which are sort of big areas of interest now in the scientific world, and we're starting to understand that a little better in terms of how we can begin to move toward that personalized approach to nutrition.
So one of the areas, Jeff, that you have been an advocate for different purposes has been the ketogenic diet, and it's something that you've also experienced and done yourself. What are the benefits starting there? It's kind of starting in the where you're restricting carbohydrates the most. What benefits have you seen from that ketogenic diet? And if you could just kind of explain to folks maybe your personal experience with it as well.
Well, sure. A ketogenic diet is one that's very low in carbohydrates, and it does vary from person to person. But on average, we're talking about a diet that has less than 50 grams per day of carbohydrate, and that really results in a very powerful stimulus for the body to shift over to burning fat. And as part of that process of breaking down fat at an accelerated rate, your body starts to produce ketones, thus the name ketogenic diet. And that seems extreme for people, but part of the reason people perceive it as extreme is because we're sort of biased in our view of what's normal. But again, throughout most of human history, we were in a ketogenic state because we didn't have a lot of access to carbohydrates, or at least transiently we went through ketogenic periods. So when you look at this, from an evolutionary perspective, it's a perfectly natural process. We've just gotten away from it over the last, especially 40 or 50 years or so, because we're constantly suppressing this metabolic pathway of ketosis because we're consuming carbohydrates. But when you restrict carbs, this pathway awakens, and there's a lot of positive health benefits associated with being in a state of nutritional ketosis, especially if you're insulin resistant and carb intolerant, which at one end of the spectrum is your type 2 diabetics. And the effects of a ketogenic diet in type 2 diabetics is remarkable. You can actually reverse type 2 diabetes with a well-formulated ketogenic diet such that a person has no overt signs or symptoms of the disease. And you can reverse metabolic syndrome or prediabetes. But we're also learning now ketogenic diets may be useful in a variety of other conditions, ranging from control of seizures, which we've known for quite some time, but now other neurological diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are showing positive effects of ketogenic diets. Some types of cancer may be very amenable to ketogenic diets, although that research is still in its infancy. And just for better control of weight and other metabolic problems. So the clinical implications are pretty profound. And there's also a growing number of athletes who are restricting carbohydrates at a level that induces ketosis, and they may not be doing it necessarily to manage diabetes or health problems, but they're doing it because of the perceived benefits in performance and or recovery.
It's a good feedback, Jeff. And one of the things you said was that to some folks the ketogenic diet seems extreme. Can you just expand on that a little bit? Why is it difficult for a lot of folks to completely eliminate carbohydrate from the diet and to follow that ketogenic diet?
Well, it's what they're used to. I mean, most people are probably eating over half their calories from carbohydrates in the form of sugar and starches. So you're asking them now to eat in a way that's very different, and food choices obviously are very different, and it's often going against what they've been taught in school and what their families and friends, may be telling them, and so it's quite a cultural shift to switch to this way of eating, although a growing number of people are doing that. It's certainly challenging in the real world because carbohydrates are so ubiquitous everywhere. But with education and knowledge about carbohydrate content of foods, it's very realistic to eat this way, and to maybe the surprise of many people listening, the diet has quite a large variety of foods that can be selected from, and the diet is incredibly pleasurable. And even if you're into cooking and cuisine, there's a tremendous amount of variety in terms of meal preparation and recipe formulation and so forth. So it's a very doable and sustainable type of diet despite popular belief.
So for those folks that for the factors you just outlined are not going to completely eliminate carbohydrate from the diet or severely restrict carbohydrate, there's still a way for them to realize the health and the performance benefits, some of the health and performance benefits that you've outlined. And that's truly by focusing on the quality of carbohydrates. So what should people who are consuming carbohydrate try to understand? What makes one carb different from another carb?
Right, absolutely. Not everyone needs a ketogenic diet. Not everyone needs a low-carb diet. This is, again, where the personalization comes in. So we've been talking a lot about the quantity of carbohydrates, which I do believe is very important. It's the first order effect, the thing that is probably most important to pay attention to. But equally important is the quality of the carbohydrates, as you suggest. And for many people, just manipulating the quality of the carbohydrates, emphasizing those carbohydrates that are less detrimental to their metabolism, is all they need to improve their health and maintain their health long term. So I'm a big believer both the quantity and the quality of carbohydrate are really probably the most important determinants of health when it comes to nutrition.
And Jeff, in speaking of the carbohydrate, as we look, it's on the screen. What's on the screen? People talk about slow release carbohydrates, low glycemic carbohydrates. Can you just explain sort of that difference between that low glycemic versus high glycemic carbohydrate as it relates to the quality of carbohydrate?
Okay, so it's a little bit of an oversimplification to talk about good and bad carbohydrates, but at least one way to operationally define that is based on how rapidly the carbohydrate is absorbed and appears in the blood as glucose. So in general, a carbohydrate that rapidly elevates blood sugar tends to cause a lot more uh, metabolic mayhem in the body just because it's perceived as a stress. The body has to uh, drive that blood sugar down as rapidly as it can, and it does that by elevating insulin levels, which, uh, if it's working properly, drives that blood sugar into cells, including fat cells, but also muscle cells and other cells in the body. And that's not how we evolved to operate on a daily basis, day after day, week after week, month after month. But yet that's what most people punish their bodies with every time they eat a meal at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They're forcing their pancreas to work overtime to maintain their blood sugar levels. So it's a really, I think, unhealthy way to maintain health by constantly going through this sort of roller coaster up and down cycle of blood sugar levels, whereas it makes much more sense to have a slow release of blood sugar into the system that doesn't cause a rapid increase in insulin levels, and that allows you also to maintain fat burning at a higher rate and have a more stable blood sugar level. It just is more compatible with health on a variety of fronts.
So, Jeff, one of the carbohydrates that really kind of fits the ideal that you just discussed is the superstarch carbohydrate in generation UCAN. And this is something that from an early stage you were involved in with some of the initial research about superstarch. And I'd just like you to take a couple minutes to kind of speak about what intrigued you about the properties of superstarch, and maybe we can start just by having you talk about the origins of the carbohydrate and what it was created for.
Yeah, I think I was exposed to superstarch almost a decade ago, and uh, I was really taken back by the story and the origins of the company that now manufactures superstarch, because it really is a very unique starch, and for those not familiar, superstarch has a very uh, unique slow absorption profile that manifests in its most distinguishing feature, which is to maintain blood glucose levels for several hours after consumption. And this has proved transformative as a therapeutic tool for management of kids with glycogen storage disease, in particular type 1 glycogen storage disease. And that's actually how the superstarch story started, because one of the founders has a child with this very rare genetic disorder that is type 1 glycogen storage disease. And you see Jonah on the screen. And this is a single point mutation in a gene, in this case, glucose 6-phosphatase in the liver, which controls release of glucose from the liver into the blood. And the way this manifests in these kids is they don't maintain their blood sugar very well, so they literally have to eat every couple hours to maintain normal blood sugar. And you can imagine just how stressful and devastating this can be on the child and the families to manage this disorder. And so the family was very motivated to search for cures and better ways to manage the disease, and came upon work done by some researchers in Scotland that were investigating all sorts of different carbohydrate sources and testing their glycemic profiles, and came upon superstarch, which is actually made from natural ingredients. It's a waxy maize, high amylopectin starch, and that's not what makes it unique. It's actually the proprietary processing, which involves prolonged treatment with heat and water, that somehow we don't completely understand all the details, changes the way this carbohydrate is digested in the gut and the small intestines. But in the end, we know that it is absorbed very slowly, but completely. So it's not in the category of a fiber or a resistant starch, which is not completely absorbed. And again, this has really changed the way kids with with this rare genetic disorder are managed, because now instead of having to eat every couple hours, they can last all night. So they may go 6, 8 hours without experiencing hypoglycemia, and this is just completely game changing for these families. So that's a pretty small percentage of the population, though, with this disease, and so the company clearly saw, UCAN clearly saw the greater application of this slow absorption profile and this starch technology, and really, at least initially, has marketed this as a alternative to the sugar-based sports drinks and gels that many athletes and active individuals are using. So it's really been I think, a true revolution in the sports nutrition beverage and sports nutrition carbohydrate field. And now it's even extending into more general consumer health and specifically type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. So we're seeing much broader applications of the starch beyond glycogen storage disease and even beyond now sports nutrition.
And Jeff, that's great. Kind of interesting to hear how it came on your radar and what intrigued you about it. And one of the things you mentioned in terms of superstarch was that ability to keep blood glucose stable, and that's really what the graph we're looking at on the screen with the red line. You're seeing that equivalent dose of superstarch compared to maltodextrin, which is a fast-acting carbohydrate that you find in a number of popular sports nutrition products. That equivalent serving of superstarch is really delivering that slow and steady release and keeping blood glucose stable instead of giving you that big spike and crash effect for maltodextrin. Now, one of the things, Jeff, that you were observing was a clinical trial that was conducted at the University of Oklahoma on racing team cyclists. And one of the looking at the graph on the screen, one of the key implications of the superstarch carbohydrate was that it didn't impact insulin levels like your typical carbohydrates do. Can you just speak a little bit to why that matters, that we have a carbohydrate that's really causing very little insulin response?
Yeah, of course. We had a couple clinical papers in the glycogen storage disease literature, and one even in the type 1 diabetic literature. But this was the first study in athletes, and it was the first time insulin had been measured. I mean, we knew that the starch didn't result in this spike in blood sugar, but we didn't really have any data on insulin. And the reason insulin is important is that's the primary regulator of lipolysis or fat breakdown. So when you're an athlete, even if you're very healthy, insulin sensitive, when you eat carbohydrate, that carbohydrate preferentially gets oxidized, and at the same time it inhibits fat burning, and that inhibition is primarily a result of the insulin response. And so that whether that's good or bad, we could have a debate about, but what's clear is that it's changing metabolism, and in this case, where with the insulin spike you see there is very dramatic with the maltodextrin, that in turn is having an inhibitory effect on subsequent fat burning and fat breakdown in these. In this case, these were healthy, well-trained cyclists.
So, Jeff, seeing a lot of questions coming in, and I'll address one. So Jay asks, with a lower insulin level, does it inhibit your ability to replenish depleted glycogen stores in the body post-exercise? How should people view a slower carbohydrate versus faster-acting carbohydrate when they're thinking of glycogen replenishment?
Well, the way I would answer that is if you're burning more fat during exercise because you're not spiking your insulin levels and emphasizing carbohydrate oxidation because of the sugar you're consuming, then you have less glycogen to resynthesize post-exercise, because in general you're switching your body over to using alternative fuel sources, i.e. fat, to a greater extent, and so there's less overall need to resynthesize glycogen. But having said that, you would likely have very similar levels of glycogen synthesis post-exercise, because the primary driver of glycogen synthesis during that window or of an hour or two after exercise is not insulin levels, it's availability of glucose. So, so there's been many studies kind of comparing low and high glycemic index carbs post-exercise on glycogen resynthesis, and the effects are pretty minor. So, you might argue you get a slight benefit of a high glycemic index carb post-exercise in terms of glycogen synthesis, but it's really small, and it's pretty myopic thinking in my mind, because there's a lot of downside to consuming a high glycemic index carb post-exercise in terms of inhibiting fat burning, inhibiting many of the beneficial effects of exercise on health. We know that when you don't consume high glycemic index carbs post-exercise, you upregulate a lot of genes that are associated with health. You see improvements in insulin sensitivity, for example, and you can completely eliminate those positive effects by ingesting high glycemic index carbs. So, in order to get this hypothetical small benefit in glycogen synthesis, you're giving up a lot of the health benefits of exercise. So it's really short-sighted in terms of the big picture.
Now, Jeff, when we talked about, started this discussion in talking about what is a quality carb, many of the things that you mentioned pertain specifically to superstarch as well. When you were speaking just in general terms about what makes something a quality carbohydrate. So with something like superstarch, where do you see the application? Across the board, whether it's health, fitness, or performance, who can benefit from something that has the properties of superstarch?
Well, I consider it a very high quality carb, so I think it fits in kind of across the board, whether you're on a low carb, moderate carb, or high carb diet. I think it would be beneficial to consume UCAN in place of some of the higher glycemic index carbs or sugars in the diet across the board. And many athletes are using it also because it's much gentler on the stomach. So sort of independent of this slow absorption profile, it's structurally a very large molecule, and so it actually has a very low osmolality, and that basically translates into better tolerability in the gut. So it doesn't sit in your stomach for long periods of time, which is what really causes a lot of the GI problems. So it gets out of the stomach quickly. It's in the intestines where the digestion slows down. So a lot of athletes who really struggle with sugars and sports drinks and so forth in terms of GI distress tolerate UCAN very well.
It's a good background, Jeff. And so let's talk a little bit now about controlling carbohydrates in different situations. And I see a lot of the questions coming in specifically on some of the performance aspects of UCAN. We'll certainly tie all that in as we move along. But let's start a little bit with general health. And, as we see now, low carb or carbohydrate control is really being embraced across all spheres, and perhaps, and maybe you can comment on this better, Jeff, but getting to be more mainstream. I've heard some say that we're really in the second low carb revolution. The first one being in the '90s when the Atkins diet gained popularity, which of course you were involved with and very familiar with. Just from an overall perspective, where do you feel we are as a country right now in terms of low carbohydrate or carbohydrate control compared to where we've been in all your years being involved with the research?
Well, it's been a slow process in terms of changing dietary guidelines and dietary beliefs in this country. But what's been more consistent is the science. I mean, I think I'd say the resurgence in interest in this area in the scientific community started around 2000. And, it's been a remarkable decade and a half in terms of the amount of positive literature on low carbohydrate diets. When looked at as a whole, it's very consistent, and in many cases you'll see low carbohydrate diets outperforming low fat diets in studies looking at weight loss, improvements in metabolic syndrome, diabetes, etc. So there's clearly I think a compelling body of literature around low carb diets. But in terms of, the population, I was actually quite surprised to see a report. It was a Nielsen uh, survey of, it was actually a world or global view of wellness, including many questions about nutrition. And according to that survey, I think it was over 25% of Americans were on a low carbohydrate diet. Um, so there was no real verification of that, but when people are asked, are you following a low carbohydrate diet, over 1 in 4 people said yes. So that to me was pretty surprising. I mean, I knew more people were interested in this, but I was a little surprised that it was that high.
That is surprising and alarming for sure. Um, so with that, Jeff, why? What sort of factors when people are reducing their carbohydrate intake for overall health should people be paying attention to? How can they know this is working?
Well, I think people are frustrated. They're gaining weight as they get older, and they may try low-fat diets, and many people who have tremendous willpower still are struggling to lose the weight or keep the weight off, and so there's a lot of just justified frustration around not being able to maintain their weight or their health, and so they're looking for alternatives. And I think for most people, it's they 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 have to kind of monitor their weight, monitor their health parameters, and use that as a guide to whether or not what you're currently doing is working. If it's not, I think you have to really look at the carbohydrates in the diet, and I think looking at the quantity and the quality of the carbohydrates, are really the first two things that need to be evaluated in your diet if you're not currently satisfied with your weight or your metabolic parameters.
The study on UCAN that we referenced was done on highly trained cyclists, and but what is there in that study that can be extrapolated to apply for general health? Is UCAN something for non-athletes that can be beneficial to utilize as a tool in their daily diet?
Well, again, I would sort of answer that by, again, bringing up this idea that the more you can switch your body over to burning fat efficiently and teaching your body and coaxing it to be able to process fat more efficiently, that's the key for maintaining weight, maintaining health, having more energy, both physically as well as cognitively, and just having a greater overall sense of well-being. It's really hard to have all those things when you're constantly eating, sugars and starches that are causing your blood sugar to go up and down. I mean, there's only a small percentage of the population that can really maintain health while doing that. So we see in the Oklahoma study that clearly there was a much less of excursion in insulin levels and a more stable source of fuel and greater fat breakdown and fat oxidation in the UCAN SuperStarch condition.
Interesting statement from Barbara in the audience. She shared that a ketogenic diet has allowed me to reverse my metabolic syndrome, lose over 60 pounds in 5 months, and complete a half marathon and 3 sprint triathlons during that time. It really works. And Dr. Volek's book changed and saved my life. And then she adds, UCAN is the sole nutrition I use during endurance training and competition, other than some protein powders. So, Barbara's one of many folks who we're hearing from, and Jeff, I'm sure you're hearing from that's really utilizing this approach to take control of her health, and it's fantastic, Barbara. Thanks for sharing, and really fantastic. Jeff, when you hear things like that, I know this is something, and really through the research that you've done, that you strongly believed in, for many years now. But when you hear more and more people coming out and saying things like that, do you ever kind of feel like I knew this all along, or how do you view that?
Well, I mean, that's outstanding, and congratulations, Barbara. But it's very inspiring for me. It's confirmatory of, I guess, the science that we've been doing. But you never know how much the science really applies or translates to real people. So it's just tremendous to hear those stories. Um, but but there are many of those stories where, when you fix a person's metabolism, uh, and by restricting their carbs to a level they can tolerate, not only does it improve their weight control and their metabolic parameters, but it gives them more energy because you've opened up their fuel flow, so that before everything was kind of clogged up. They weren't able to process carbs well because they're carb intolerant. They're not burning fat well because their mitochondria are not developed. So when you sort of correct all of those metabolic problems simply by restricting the carbs, then they actually want to go exercise. They have the energy to run half marathons or marathons, and that sort of has then a self-reinforcing and health promoting effects that go along, sort of complement the diet, and so it's fantastic, very encouraging, to know that what we're kind of seeing in the laboratory is playing out, with many people around the world.
Jeff, let's shift gears a little bit to performance because we have a lot of questions, on the performance aspect of this. And I just want to highlight one thing that's interesting is that you see more and more high level athletes adopting this approach. And I believe last summer there was a lot of media coverage in a Sports Illustrated article about LeBron James, who dropped a significant amount of weight, somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 pounds, by really reducing his carbohydrate and sugar intake, and adopting a lower carbohydrate diet. And in this article, Jeff, you were quoted as saying that there's a growing number of athletes who have been told that they need carbs, and now you see them questioning that conventional wisdom. You've obviously done a lot of work in sports nutrition. You have a lot of your former students that are working with various pro and collegiate teams. What are you seeing with elite athletes now adopting this approach?
Yeah, well, clearly with 30 million Americans with diabetes and 60 million with pre-diabetes, we, our work with low-carb diets is really focused on that group just because of the cost and the impact. But what's been really fascinating in the last few years in particular is there have been this sort of growing legion of athletes, in particular in the ultra endurance world, but also in different sports like basketball, that have abandoned their traditional high carb diet and in favor of a low carb, moderate protein, high fat diet. And I've kind of known that this could be potentially beneficial for certain athletes, but we really hadn't focused on that in the laboratory. And there's not a lot of funding to do that type of work, so it's just been kind of more of an interest to hypothesize about it. But now there's all these athletes out there that are experiencing benefit from the diet and talking about it online in many cases, and so it's starting to become a population that potentially could be studied, and that's something that I was interested in doing, and we actually designed a study a couple years ago to do that, and there's many other groups now I think very interested in this area to better understand the low carb athlete or the keto adapted athlete. But clearly that's a growing trend, and it's very counterintuitive, at least in terms of traditional understanding of the need for carbs if you want to optimize performance and recovery that we've been told for the last 4 decades. But there's no denying the fact that these athletes are doing well. I mean, nobody's putting a gun to their head saying you have to restrict carbohydrates. They're doing it because there's some self-perceived benefit. And at least in the ultra-endurance world, I mean, it's more than just finishing races. Many of these guys and gals are winning races, and in many cases setting U.S. and even world records. So it's real. It's not every athlete, but there's clearly some athletes that are much better suited by a low carb diet than a traditional high carb diet.
And when you talk about athletes, in the ultra endurance world, utilizing this approach and winning races, there was recently an example of this at Western States. Am I right about that?
Yeah, Western States is a very grueling 100-mile trail run through the Sierra Nevada mountains. So it's a pretty amazing race to watch. And I actually took my lab group out there in 2012, and we had the opportunity to collect data on a group of athletes, including a group of low carb athletes. And turns out, yeah, the winner that year, and he came back the subsequent year, was a low carb athlete. And in 2012, he actually set a course record, beating the previous record by over 30 minutes. So it's quite amazing. And there were several low carb athletes who finished in the top of the pack. So that again is kind of a game changer for many athletes that are competing at that level of competition.
Jeff, this is a question I'm sure that you get all the time, and we have several people asking a different variation of this question from Suzanne, Amy, Susan, Blake, Ben. But the basic question in the audience that many people are asking is, for racing or exercise at an intense level, say 5K running, cycling, time trials. Um, they're wondering if when you're pushing the intensity and the exertion, how well does this approach work? So Suzanne, I think, expresses what we hear often and you hear often, which is slow release fuel and fat utilization doesn't seem like it would work well during high intensity exercise. Can you comment on that?
Well, there's not a lot of great research, at least in the lab, that's evaluated this. But what you have to understand is, uh, even in the most keto adapted athlete who's very consuming very few carbohydrates, they still have glycogen levels. In fact, our most recent study where we had elite keto adapted athletes in the lab showed they had exactly the same glycogen as their high carb counterparts, and they had the same glycogen depletion during exercise and synthesis post exercise. So there are some very unexpected adaptations over the long term. I mean, these were guys who were adapted over an average of 18 months. But but it's not like carbohydrates go away, like, or your carbohydrate stores go away in the form of glycogen when you're keto adapted. So if you need to to access that glycogen, it's still there. Um, and the other, sort of take a step back and think about the big picture. I mean, most people are not exercising because they're competing and performing at the highest level. I mean, they're mostly doing it for health, and it makes them feel better, and and for appearance, and whatever, if there is a performance benefit of carbs during higher intensity exercise, it's probably small, and in my mind, it's clearly not contributing to better body composition or better health outcomes. So, everybody's different. They exercise for different reasons, and they also respond different to carbohydrates. So I think every person sort of needs to figure this out, whether or not a low-carb approach would be right for them. And I'm not saying that it should be tried by everybody. I think this is where, it should be considered as an option. And if people choose to try it, we should support them, and we should try to learn how it will affect performance and health and recovery. And recovery is the other piece that we don't always talk about, but there may not be a direct benefit of a low-carb diet on high-intensity performance, but there could be indirect benefits on recovery, because we know, for example, now that ketone bodies are more than just alternative fuel for the brain. They are actually potent signals for affecting gene expression, for example. So one of the most common anecdotes from low-carb athletes is that they recover faster. And that's probably related to less inflammation, less oxidative stress, just less overall trauma as a result of the high levels of exercise they're doing, so they recover faster and they can tolerate then greater amounts of training. So that might be sort of an indirect benefit for the more strength or power athletes. They also may be able to lose more body fat easier, and that increases the power to weight ratio. So there's a lot of factors here that, again, kind of need to be considered and weighed in when a person is trying to decide whether or not a low carb diet is something that would be of benefit for them personally.
Now, one of the things as we talk about carbohydrate intake and performance that sometimes people might get confused about is when we're talking about UCAN specifically and this slower release carbohydrate and its ability to allow you to utilize more fat. People are sometimes not realizing that UCAN is still providing you carbohydrates. So it's not like, when you're using UCAN, you're solely burning fat. You're getting glucose. It's just the rate at which you're getting glucose that is unique about UCAN in comparison to other traditional carbohydrates that you find in sports nutrition. So what might the benefit be, from a performance standpoint of getting glucose at a steady rate, like with UCAN versus getting that rapid delivery of glucose from, say, maltodextrin, which is, again, as we talked about, found in a large number of your popular sports nutrition products?
Well, UCAN's really unique because, again, it transcends all different levels of carb. I mean, there are keto-adapted athletes using UCAN during exercise where it's not really inhibiting their fat burning at all. They're still maintaining ketosis and high levels of fat oxidation because it's just coming in so slowly and not stimulating insulin. But it's maintaining their blood sugar levels, and it may be having other effects we don't fully understand. But it's also being used by athletes on high carbohydrate diets, and again it may not be these athletes may not be having the same high level of fat oxidation, but whatever level of fat oxidation you have on a high or moderate carbohydrate diet, if you displace some of the carbs with UCAN, you would have a proportionally greater amount of reliance on fat. And that's where the benefit comes in. The more you can kind of rely on fat and take the pressure off of providing a steady source of glucose, the better off you are if you're an athlete, and better off you are in terms of just the maintaining health and extending your career if you're an athlete.
So, Jeff, this might be something that you might just have to sort of surmise, and I can share some of the anecdotal data that we've received. But Eric asks, if an athlete's on a ketogenic diet, how would you recommend using superstarch, and what impact would it have on their state of ketosis?
Yeah, all I can speak to is anecdotes and some of the people we've studied in the lab, for example, who were keto adapted, were regular users of UCAN, and they were pretty religious in testing their ketones, and when they used UCAN during prolonged exercise, they were still able to maintain ketosis. So we haven't studied this in the laboratory yet formally in any research studies, but at least anecdotally there are athletes out there on ketogenic diets using UCAN strategically either before or during exercise, and it does not seem to be having any impairment in their high levels of fat oxidation.
And just just again, kind of extrapolating what you know about what throws you in and out of ketosis and the way UCAN works. I mean, obviously, we're talking about a carbohydrate that's allowing anecdotally folks to stay in ketosis. Why is this the case?
Well, again, I think it's coming back to the very low impact on insulin levels. Again, insulin is the primary hormone controlling fat breakdown, and that's the first step in ketone production, is having enough fatty acids be delivered from your fat cells to the liver. So UCAN is, you do have glucose coming into the blood and it's sort of trickling in, but it's not registering any major effect on insulin. So you're able to have glucose come in and maintain your blood sugar levels on a steady level, but not impair fat burning to a great extent.
Jeff, we're slowly winding down on our time here. Maybe we'll just take about 5 minutes to direct a few more questions your way that don't necessarily fit specifically into the topics we've discussed today. But I'll pose one from Mary. Mary says, as a scientist, are you satisfied that long term, by long term she clarifies years or a lifetime of nutritional ketosis is safe? And then she adds the caveat, as long as health markers are good.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I've been studying this for 20 years and trying to really identify if there are specific individuals who don't respond well. And I think the only caveat I would say with that is if you have a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and this sort of takes us into a whole other discussion, but there are certain um, things that one needs to understand and when it comes to designing a ketogenic diet, because there are changes, for example, in the way you handle minerals. And if you don't understand that your body excretes more sodium when you're in ketosis, then you can run into problems. Not necessarily dangerous problems, but maybe enough to cause someone to have side effects and not be able to, continue the diet. But they're easily uh, those side effects are easily controlled if you understand that and add an extra gram or two of salt in your diet. There's issues around the quality of fat that you should emphasize on a ketogenic diet and so forth. But overall, if you understand those principles, humans, um, you know, survived again during most of their time on this planet, being at least transiently in ketosis. So, and then we have examples from many cultures like the Inuit and the Maasai who were they didn't just survive. You could argue many of those cultures thrived on a diet very low in carbohydrate that was likely ketogenic. So we have sort of that evolutionary and cultural history to draw on, and then we have all the modern science now uh, that sort of back up that premise that the diet is safe long term.
Caroline asks, what would you recommend for carbohydrate intake to keep blood sugar stable? She says, I know ketosis is 50 grams or less, but what about just a lower amount per day? Do you have a general recommendation?
I really can't point to a single number of grams of carbs per day or percent because people do vary so widely. I mean, in a profoundly insulin resistant type 2 diabetic, they often require strict ketosis to be able to maintain blood sugar levels. But there are some very insulin sensitive folks out there that can eat a lot of carbohydrates and their bodies tolerate it very well and they're able to maintain normal blood sugars. So it really depends on the person. It can cover the whole gamut. So that's something each person sort of needs to figure out themselves. And then, as I said earlier, it changes within a person too over time. So it's kind of one of those things that you need to kind of keep your eye on and have regular sort of checkups to make sure that you're not developing pre-diabetes or diabetes. And
And
exercise doesn't help everyone. I mean, I know world-class athletes who've developed type 2 diabetes, and the only way they could control it was to restrict carbs.
Jeff, I'll leave you with two more questions. So we've got one from Reggie who says, realizing that this may depend on each individual, how long does the adaptation period take if an athlete were to start adapting to the lower carb diet? And he says, I'm in the midst of marathon training. Would you recommend starting to implement the diet now or begin it after the race and experiment what level of carb intake is correct for me?
There is a time period, so it takes at least 3 to 4 weeks to kind of get your body switched over from a carb based to a fatty acid and ketone based metabolism. And if you don't understand that, you might get discouraged because your performance will go down the first week, and you need to sort of adjust your training volume accordingly. You don't want to try this diet a week before a marathon because you'll almost assuredly be disappointed. Um, so We usually recommend, you kind of cut your volume of training in half the first week, and then gradually your tolerance to exercise will improve. And in many cases, or most cases, by 2, 3, 4 weeks, you're not only back up to your previous training volume, but you have a greater tolerance for training and improvement in your ability to exercise. So you do have to kind of, you know, give it a good 3 to 4 weeks to come back. And there may be more subtle adaptations that take even longer. We really don't understand this. It's something that we're trying to address in the laboratory. But clearly, at least 3 to 4 weeks to get through that initial keto adaptation.
And to be clear on that, Jeff, and I think you were very clear, but I just want to emphasize that what you're talking about is really if people are trying to significantly manipulate what fuel source their body is predominantly relying on. But what you said previously was that whether you're high carb or low carb, something like UCAN can really be beneficial to implement at any time because that power of steady blood sugar, that's kind of something you want to focus on all the time, right? It doesn't matter what kind of diet you're eating. You always want to try to focus on keeping your blood sugar stable as much as possible for all the reasons we've outlined, whether it's health or really primarily for health purposes. So am I interpreting that correctly? That while there's an adaptation period here, there's no adaptation period to wanting to control your blood sugar.
That's correct, and I don't think there's any adaptation to use of UCAN, so that's something that can be of benefit on a low, moderate, or high carb diet, and it's something that should be evident right away.
The last one for you, Jeff. Again, I had a number of people ask some variation of this question, but if you are on a low carb diet and counting carbs, how should one count UCAN carbs on a low carb diet? And I just guess before you address that specifically, are you a proponent of counting carbs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had an equally great answer. But what I tend to encourage people to do, at least if you're on a ketogenic diet, there's a way to know if you're in ketosis. You actually measure ketones, and that's incredibly helpful and empowering for people to know if they're in ketosis. And you can do that with urine strips. It's not the greatest method. There's some problems with that in terms of false negatives and so forth. Better if you can measure blood levels through a finger stick using a glucometer with ketone strips versus glucose strips, because that actually tells you whether or not you're in ketosis, and so you can actually personalize the diet. And there's really no, you don't have to count carbs that way. If you're not in ketosis, you need to eat fewer carbs or possibly less protein too. And just know that whenever you're in ketosis, that's the sort of mix of foods that you can eat. And whether or not you count superstarch carbs, you probably can get away eating more carbs if they're from superstarch. But again, the best way to know that would be to actually measure ketones, or if you're not in ketosis, at least measure your blood sugar to know that you're not stimulating your blood sugar levels after you consume meals.
Jeff, I think that's a fantastic answer. Just overall, a lot of great perspective from you. I know we could easily have you on here for another 2 hours and dive really, really deep into a lot of these topics. You are a busy guy, so I appreciate you giving up an hour of your time. And I just wanted to let folks know that if you are interested in really taking a deeper dive into several of these topic areas, two of Jeff's books, both of which I've read, which are fantastic, The Art and Science of Low Carb Living, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance, both really, really good reads, kind of depending on what you're interested in on a personal level of implementing this nutritional approach for. I highly recommend one or both of these books to really get a greater understanding on this. And then one of the big things that I think Jeff talked about throughout this is really treating yourself like a laboratory. There's ways to get the data. There's ways to measure all this, and really in order to understand the impact that carbohydrates are having on you, you really should be driven by the data. You can certainly be driven by how you feel and what results you see in terms of body composition and weight loss, but ultimately the data will help you tell the story. So both these books available on Amazon, and highly recommend checking them out. Jeff, before we sign off today, anything that you would like to add to close us out?
No, I just want to say thank you, Veron. It's a pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective with everyone.
Fantastic. Well, Jeff, we'll definitely do this again. I know there's always more research in this field coming up. You're always involved in a host of various studies and always looking at this stuff in the lab. And that's really what we appreciate so much about your perspective, is that you've put in the work and the research and the time to really find out for yourself on a lot of the topics that we're talking about. So we'll likely hit you up again for this in a few months. But until then, everybody will receive a full recording of this webinar by email here in a couple hours. You'll also find it on our Facebook page, on our Twitter page, on YouTube. And for all of you that ask questions, I hope we were able to answer as much of them as possible. You can expect a personal reply from me over the next day or two, and I hope we're able to address as many of your specific questions as we can. For Dr. Jeff Volek, I'm Varun Sriram. Really appreciate all of you hanging out with us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.